Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to which sadly is the last research talk in our English research seminar lunchtime series. But we're delighted that you're able to join us this afternoon. And this talk is going to be given by my colleague, Dr. Chloe Harrison. Chloe is a lecturer in English language and literature at Aston. She's got research interests and expertise in stylistics, contemporary fiction, and in reader response. She's the author of many works in those areas, including authoring the book Cognitive Grammar in Contemporary Fiction and the co-author of Cognitive Grammar in Literature, Cognitive Grammar in Stylistics, a Practical Guide, and New Directions in Cognitive Grammar and Style. So there's clearly a pattern there. Chloe's going to talk today on tele-cinematic stylistics, voiceover narration, and split selves in the Handmaid's Tale TV series. As with all our talks in this series, she'll talk for 40-45 minutes or so, and then there'll be a chance to ask questions either on the mic or in the chat at the end. If I could ask you, please, just to make sure your mics are off during the talk, that would be much appreciated. And so I'll hand over to Chloe now.
Thanks, Marcello, and thank you for the introduction. Can everyone hear me and see the slides okay? Is that all working as it should? If you just let me know in the chat if you can hear me and see the slides fine. For some reason, Blackboard has been a bit funny today, and my message that I just sent decided to send 20 times. So I'll start with that. Thank you all for coming. I do really appreciate you being here, especially given that we're now approaching the Easter break. So yeah, thank you for attending today. So the research paper that I'm going to talk about this afternoon is actually a departure from other avenues of research that I've been exploring recently. So Marcello mentioned some of my cognitive grammar publications recently, but it's actually a movement away from cognitive grammar this afternoon. As the title suggests here, I'll be looking at voiceover narration and specifically the idea of telecinematic stylistics. So the ideas that I'll talk about then for the next 40 minutes or so will be based on a paper that I have written up for the Language and Literature Journal. If anyone is interested in that and having a look at these ideas after today's session, I'm happy to send you the link to that piece. But I would like to develop telecinematic research in a bit more detail a bit further down the line. So of course I would welcome your thoughts and feedback on today's ideas. Okay, right, so I'm assuming then that most people here are familiar with the Handmaid's Tale story or the text, but just for some general context for those of you who are perhaps less familiar with it. So the Handmaid's Tale TV series was first broadcast in 2017, and it's based on the 1985 novel of the same name by contemporary Canadian author Margaret Atwood. The series is set in a dystopian future America and follows June, also known as Offred, and her life as a handmaid, a woman who is forced to bear children for wealthy families under the theocratic totalitarian regime of Gilead. So the story kind of follows June Offred's kind of new life under this regime. And Margaret Atwood famously said that when she was writing the Handmaid's Tale novel, she didn't include anything that hasn't happened at some point in the world. So because of that, it kind of falls into the speculative fiction rather than sci-fi camp. And because of that as well, it means that watching the TV series is actually quite a difficult experience. It deals with social themes that are very kind of close to kind of current concerns, and consequently some viewers say that because of that it kind of becomes quite horror-esque when you watch it. It's a difficult and kind of scary watch. Other reviewers or other viewers have also said that it creates a kind of sense of claustrophobia when you watch the series. And there's a kind of imprecision in the story, in the narrative, the way in which it's told, which contributes to the way that it creates anxiety amongst audiences. And I'll be touching upon some of these ideas throughout the analysis today. So the series then won lots of awards, has received great critical acclaim, rather, winning 8 Emmy Awards from 13 nominations, as well as 2 Golden Globe Awards for Best Television Series and Best Actress for Elizabeth Moss, who plays June Offred. And this quotation here is Elizabeth Moss responding to an interview within the Hollywood Reporter, where she talks about the kind of main aim of the show, of the TV series. She says it's a character-driven show, it's not action-focused, and that's always the most important thing to us, focusing on the characters and telling their stories. Things that happen around them just inform that. I think this is a nice quotation because it underpins, I guess, the kind of aim of my research paper here. I wanted to explore how Offred's, or June's, character is represented in the series, and how that representation via the text is reflected in some of the production choices and the visual choices in the series. So to that end, I'm combining ideas from stylistics and film studies. But first, just to kind of put this in a bit of context then, so historically, stylisticians, when they have analysed film, TV, drama, they tend to apply ideas from pragmatics and conversation analysis to explore the text. Dan McIntyre's 2008 study of Ian McKellen's Richard III kind of moved away from this a bit, and he identified that traditional film studies approaches can overlook sometimes the use of dialogue and the interaction between language and non-language choices. And because it does overlook that kind of interaction between the linguistic and the non-linguistic elements of the kind of drama, it can tend to fall at either end of the scale in terms of level of detail, exploring either macro level issues of a film or, conversely, a micro-analysis of specific frames. So he argues then that looking at the interaction between language and non-language choices in drama is a way of addressing the levels in between that aren't accounted for, so that the kind of meso or meso levels, and also enables us, as McIntyre says, to explore the more prominent stylistic effects that take place in the narrative. So I would argue then that one of the more prominent stylistic effects in the Handmaid's Tale TV series relates to viewers' understanding of June Offred's character, specifically as the teller of the tale. However, though June Offred narrates part of her story, film studies theorists also acknowledge in TV and film that we always have a filmic narrator in telecinematic narratives. In other words, someone else behind the scenes, or who's holding the camera, who is making production choices, who is also telling the story. So even while we're kind of focused on a main character across a series, there are all other people behind the scenes who contribute to the kind of telling and the kind of transmission of the story. To refer to this role, film studies theorists tend to use different labels, and sort of filmic narrator is one that comes up. Bordwell uses that term to apply to this other kind of entity who's telling the story. But Jan in 2003 used the term, or suggested the term, instead of a filmic composition device, which he refers to as an FCD. And he says that this label indicates that the cinematic narrator is not just a homogeneous, monolithic agent with a human-like voice, but rather can be seen as a separate agent or group of agents who put together what is seen on screen. So in other words, sort of following this idea or this kind of definition, there isn't just one single filmic narrator, but instead there's a collective group of people, and there's a collective FCD, which is assembled by choices from a number of people behind the scenes, including, for example, the camera operator, the producer, the director, and so on. So lots of people say that the FCD, the production choices in this TV series are really strongly characterized and stylized. It's something that which people, when they're kind of talking about this, often say, oh, they talk about the visuals or the aesthetics of the series. And viewers talk about it, as I said, as being particularly distinctive, stylized, and as having a kind of Instagram type quality. Such distinctive mise-en-scène style choices in the series relate to, for instance, the use of colour, lighting, costume, and sustained use of symmetrical composition, which I'll talk about shortly. So in the series, just to kind of pick out a couple of examples of this really kind of overt FCD presence. In the series, lighting is manipulated in the Gilead and the pre-Gilead narrative strands, for example. So Gilead scenes are filtered through a sepia yellow tone, as you can see in the screenshots on the screen here, while pre-Gilead, on the other hand, is represented in a brighter and a kind of colder tone. So such a contrast suggests that these different states are filtered through contrastingly more realist, as compared to more romanticized lenses, by this kind of filmic narrator, or the FCD position. Similarly, colours are manipulated in other mise-en-scène choices, such as costume. The different social roles of the characters are represented through different uniforms, mostly set through primary colours, with the deep red of the handmaid's clothes in particular often foregrounded in otherwise colourless scenes. And again, if you look at the image in front of you here, we can kind of see that deep red of Offred's dress, which is kind of drawing attention to her position in the room. So these general choices, these very stylized choices regarding lighting, arrangement, and tone, mean that the voice of the FCD, of the filmic narrator, is distinct, striking, and actually never fully backgrounded when we watch this series. Okay, so in addition then to looking at the interaction between visual choices and linguistic choices, I'm also interested in looking at how June Offred's character is represented to us across the series. So as she said earlier on, it's a character-driven show, and it's mostly focused on her and her perspective. And to kind of explore this, applying some ideas from Cathy Emmett's split self concept. I think Cathy is actually here today, so if I misrepresent your arguments here, Cathy, just let me know, just jump in at any point. So following Cathy Emmett's definition then, the term split self very broadly refers to or includes all cases of a character or real life individual being divided and or duplicated in any way in the narrative. And in Emmett's 2002 application, she looks at examples of individuals who perceive themselves to be split because of a transitory sense of experiential discontinuity or because of a traumatic life change. So I think that this idea and this argument is really relevant for the Handmaid's Tale series, in which audiences encounter multiple iterations of June Offred's character. So she is duplicated from the outset of the series. So audiences learn in episode 1, for example, that her name is June, but also Offred, which identifies her pre-Gilead name, as well as conferring her status as belonging to the commander Fred in Gilead. So Offred is a compound of being of Fred. Of course, more superordinately, more generally, she is also the handmaid whose tale we are listening to, so she assumes that role within Gilead. And she is further duplicated through flashbacks in many episodes across the series. So in episode 4, for example, which we'll touch upon a bit later on, she is shown in her former life with her husband Luke and her daughter Hannah when they visit a fair, but she's also shown to be sitting in her bedroom in Gilead while she mentally recounts the memory. So in these kinds of contexts, the division of selves is signposted through both visual splicing, so production choices, as well as through verbal choices. So for example, a shift in tense in the voiceover narration when she returns to Gilead. So Emmett goes on to say then that split self presentation might be seen as being inherent in the narrative form, since first person narratives generally invoke a current self reporting on a past self, and that's a quotation from her 2002 study. So I would argue that in a similar way, voiceovers and interior monologues in TV and film also inherently invite this split self setup. So in these scenarios, we watch someone on screen and we hear their monologue, but that monologue is spatiotemporally displaced. So it's kind of occurring in a different kind of time and place. And it's this idea of mediation and of kind of retelling of narratives that's actually a central theme in the novel. So like other Atwood narratives, the story has a reveal at the end of the book, which reframes the contents of the rest of the tale. An epilogue finishes with a conference set in the future at which academics are discussing Gilead long after its dissolution. It's revealed that June Offred's story, presented in the first 300 pages of the book, were actually a transcription of a series of cassettes that have recorded her accounts. This framing is referenced in the adaptation's first series in a subtle way, and I only noticed this on my third or fourth rewatch of the series. So after the opening sequence of episode 1 recounts June Offred being captured and her daughter Hannah being taken away, there is a very quiet, and I say quiet, it does sort of follow quite a noisy chase scene which appears just before, but there is an audible click of an audio cassette recorder just before June Offred begins her first interior monologue voiceover. So such signposts then suggest that this reframing will be acknowledged in the series as it continues, though of course it remains to be seen how the epilogue will be addressed at the end of the final series. It's still ongoing. I can't remember what number we're up to in the TV series. I think we're up to series 4 at least. So consequently, it could be argued that a preoccupation with the Handmaid's Tale narrative across both novel and series concerns the ownership or mediation of voice and the removal of narrator agency. So this theme is actually identified in the title itself. The story is a tale, which is a label that removes it from real life, as Atwood herself has commented on. And audiences are therefore primed for a narrative that is removed from real life, even while the themes and the content are actually ones which are very familiar, as we mentioned. So that's the context then for this study. As I mentioned, there's the two things that I'm trying to explore. So how June Offred's split self is represented across the series, but also how we can kind of look at that all those interconnections between linguistic choices and non-linguistic choices or production choices. So to carry out this study then, I focused on the first series of The Handmaid's Tale, and there are 10 episodes in the series as a whole. It meant watching quite a lot of TV, to be honest. I think I had to watch it 3 or 4 times to go through it and to get a grasp of how things were structured. What I did was I transcribed the voiceovers in the series, so where they appeared, and I numbered each voiceover according to the episode firstly, and then where it appeared in the chronology of voiceovers for that episode. So 10:4 refers to the 4th voiceover that appears in episode 10, for example. And then for the analysis, key sections of the verbal text data were represented in tables alongside a description of the notable corresponding visual production choices. I should say at this point that I didn't include in this the non-speech sound stream, which Michael Toolan argues makes up the 3rd channel of communication in film and TV. As unfortunately it was just beyond the scope of the study and the kind of space that the paper gave me. That said though, the diegetic and the non-diegetic sound and music choices in the series are really interesting and noteworthy, and to be honest kind of warrant a paper in themselves. So some really interesting kind of electro indie covers of 80s bands and all kinds of things going on with those choices. But as I said, that's a separate paper. So what I noticed then, once I'd put the kind of data together, I looked at these voiceovers, which, as I've said here in that first bullet point, there's between 1 and 14 per episode. They tended to be used predominantly in the first half of the series, kind of more frequently. So the first episode had 14 in it, for example. That works out as roughly a mean of 5 per episode. So these voiceovers then were used for narrative exposition to explain what's going on, and I guess that kind of function is something we'd expect to see predominantly in the first episode or the earlier episodes of the series. It's also used for rhetorical and unrealized dialogue. So there's lots of instances where June Offred is not allowed to speak, and so the voiceover or the interior monologue is a way of her kind of verbalizing her response to the things around her. And it's also used to signpost flashbacks, and it's kind of used to describe her responses to those flashbacks, which if we have time, we'll talk about in a little bit. So that was kind of my approach then to sort of setting up the study. So one of the things that I noticed when we're sort of considering the FCD and the production choices here is that during the voiceovers, we I think always, I need to revisit to see if there's an exception to this, but I'll go with always. We always have symmetrical composition shots whenever we hear the voiceover of June or Offred. So a symmetric or symmetrical composition shots are cinematic shots with near perfect symmetry, often popular with horror directors. So those of you who are Stanley Kubrick fans, or maybe you've seen The Shining, and you think about that kind of iconic image of the twins standing at the end of the hallway, that is an example of a symmetric composition shot. So what these shots do is they work by drawing viewers' attention to a specific focal point at the center of the scene. Such staging is kind of a hallmark of horror because it creates a real sense of uneasiness or dread, because viewers are frequently positioned to wait for the focal point to be revealed, and also because the uncanniness of the composition can indicate a sense of entrapment in some instances. So actually, I guess this kind of contributes to that claustrophobia that we feel when we watch this series. So in The Handmaid's Tale, this composition, that's kind of symmetrical setup, can be frequently seen with June Offred's figure or face forming the focal or the vanishing point. And we can see this if you look at figure 1 at the top of the page there, you can see that kind of that symmetrical setup. Equally, doors and windows also form the center point quite frequently. And again, we can see that window and the shutters behind her in this image. And this obviously helps to kind of foreground other central themes in the series, such as imprisonment and surveillance that run throughout the narrative. So the use of symmetrical composition here then differs from traditional applications of this choice or of this composition, because it's coupled with very shallow focus shots. And by that I mean the depth of perception in the sort of cinematic choices is often really, really shallow. The vanishing point, the center point that we're kind of invited to look at, is not always placed, or at least very infrequently in fact, placed far away from the camera. So shallow focus is an approach in which several planes of focus are incorporated within one single image. And where this occurs in conjunction with voiceovers, viewers are often positioned close to a particular character or object in the scene, who is represented in great detail and clarity, and at the same time, other bits of the scene are backgrounded through schematization, or what Cress and Valerne say or call modalization. And again, we can see that in figure 2 here. So June Offred's face is represented really kind of close to the camera and really clearly, and we can see that kind of sort of blurring of the background behind her. As a side note to this, in another interview, Elizabeth Moss said that she was actually often hit on the head with the camera as the cameraman was filming the series, because they were that close, and I think you do get a sense of that in these shots. So as we've seen then, so during the voiceovers and other scenes throughout the series, her face is shown very clearly and very close to the camera. These close-up shots allow the audience greater emotional connection to a character in a kind of general sense, but also increase the sense of claustrophobia generated by this arrangement. And the close alignment with the character perspective can become at times uncomfortable, and I think that's something which I certainly kind of noted as I was watching the series, and maybe you did too. It is this discomfort that means that the conjunction of a voiceover with a close-up of the character face is actually typically associated with the horror genre as well. So Jan Albert in a 2017 paper described, for example, how the use of this technique in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho is similarly kind of disconcerting. Furthermore, such a close focus on the character's face narrows the visual field and therefore restricts the visual information offered to viewers. In turn, this physical constraint mirrors the metaphorical implications of June Offred's limited perspective in Gilead. We can't see very much, and nor can she across the story, across the narrative. So this is something then that I went to look at within the kind of the verbal text as well. So table 1, which hopefully you can see on the slide here, shows how I kind of sort of described or outlined the data, the verbal text alongside the visual text and the production choices. So what we frequently have then, when we see these voiceovers and when we see the kind of shallow focus shot with the symmetrical composition where her face is kind of at the center, as viewers, we are primed for a what's called a subjective shot, or a point of view shot in film studies and film theory. That means usually we'd expect to see what she's looking at, and we'd hope that the next kind of seed would show what she's looking at. So we're primed for a reveal, but we're not actually shown what she's looking at in these voiceovers. And that's something I examined through this particular example from the series. So June Offred's narration here actually mirrors the opening sentences of the novel, which show a sequential ordering of items listed in an atemporal way. So we have a chair, a table, a lamp, and then also through present tense narrative. So there is a window, there's a window with white curtains. Louise Nuttall's analysis of this scene in the prose narrative identifies how this sequence of attentional frames can create a collage or a puzzle effect, which works to kind of challenge readers' conceptualization of the fictional world that's represented to us. If we kind of look at those ideas in the context of the series, though, in the visual text of this voiceover, viewers understanding the through the fact that the silhouette cast by June Offred and the hazy light and contrasting darkness in the rest of the shot renders details difficult to discern and work out initially. The sequential introduction of objects in the room is brought out visually, however, as the scene progresses, though these details relate to June Offred specifically, so the colour of her dress, her facial expression, rather than to those objects in the room that she is describing. So this creates a zooming in effect where the camera moves closer and closer to June's perspective as the voiceover progresses, but without clarifying what she's describing, which is what we as viewers are waiting for. So she focalizes the scene and she increasingly becomes the center of attention. In other words, audiences contemplate her visually while she contemplates other things verbally. So these techniques then work together to isolate June Offred's position in space and also to create separation between her and her surroundings, I would argue. This division occurs in the verbal text where June Offred can be seen to separate herself mentally from her new situation. She distances herself from the rest of the handmaids. So you can see here, she states, for example, that a handmaid wouldn't get far, rather than associating herself with the group. She doesn't say, I wouldn't get far. As well as the means of escape available to those in this group as evidenced through the use of distal dexis. She talks about those other escapes. And even despite the fact that this is obviously a preoccupation of her thoughts, I try not to think of those escapes, suggests that she frequently does. The otherness of her new identity is also explicitly mentioned when she references that she had another name. And she talks at the end of this extract here about how that's something which is now forbidden. So given that then that the nominal profiles in the start of the voiceover relate to objects in a domestic setting, so a chair, a table, a lamp, the reference to opening an escape could initially be interpreted literally. Viewers might think of opening a door to escape, and that's something which, given what's going on in the visuals here, there's a kind of window behind her, that's something that's kind of supported there through the kind of visual choices. However, the addition of in yourself indicates the physical act June Offred is describing. She's referencing the body as a kind of container in which pathways can be opened up. So the episode finishes with June Offred stating that her name is June. That's the kind of last thing that she says. Though audiences may be aware that the episode is titled Offred. So consequently, even at the very macro level of the episode, this division of self has been acknowledged. And I'll come back to container metaphors shortly if I have some time. Okay. So let's then consider another example of how the verbal and the visual text work in context. So whilst we could maybe argue that with the previous voiceover that I looked at, there's a bit of a kind of disjunction between the FCD choices and Offred's narration, and we're not kind of given what we are looking for. At other points in the series, the visual text and the choices of the FCD work together in concert with the verbal text. So in voiceover 2.2 outlined here, in the second episode, Birthday, for example, June Offred's verbal text similarly acknowledges a division and separation between herself, she says us, and the rulers of Gilead, them, and she questions whether to categorize herself among the latter group. So she asks, there isn't us. Unlike the visual choices in the first voiceover, voiceover 1.1, however, there is some support from the FCD as to the content of the verbal text, namely here, we can see the bars of the gate that she's standing next to as she's talking about this societal division via her voiceover and via her interior monologue. And as you can see as well, if you look at the verbal text, it mimics a political template. June Offred provides exposition of the current situation and a comparison with the past by mentioning now in 3 successive sentences, and by acknowledging the new heads of state, so the guardians of the faithful and the new capital Anchorage. Despite these rhetorical choices, which are hallmarks of spoken political discourse, as Feinberg notes in her review of the series, Offred is able to reveal her thoughts via voiceover only. So this lack of freedom is foregrounded by the FCD on the visual level. One of the only discernible parts of the background are the bars of the gate, for example, and the camera follows her physical movement in front of to the bars of the gate. So we kind of follow her or track her in relation to this gate at this point. The FCD then becomes collaborative. It unifies the voice of June Offred 1 with the visual presentation of June Offred 2 in this scene. So we could argue then that observing June Offred visually while she contemplates other things verbally creates a clash between the familiar and the impersonal, which is a phenomenon also brought about through the choice of shallow focus shots alongside voiceover narration. Kozlov, 1988, argues that voiceovers are a humanizing device. At the same time, however, shallow focus cinematography, as in these examples are flagged up here, is actually associated with unreality. That's why kind of shallow focus is sort of seen to be kind of an Instagram hallmark. It's not associated with something that's real, and it has this sense of artifice and production. Since its use can create a purposely less realistic image, one that manipulates viewer attention and suggests different planes of action, both literally and figuratively. Consequently, the interplay between image and text in the scenes where a voiceover is accompanied by shallow focus shots of June Offred's face creates this unsettling imbalance between artifice and reality. The voiceover humanizes her, but the choices of the FCD detaches the audience from her character. So it's a real sort of strange kind of tug of war where it's both we're kind of moving closer to her, but also we're aware increasingly of the artifice. Such a tug of war between the metaphorical and the humanized again could be argued to foreground the division of the self represented here. So June Offred is both humanized to viewers and objectified in her current surroundings. The FCD shows her as an isolated character who narrates what is on her mind, but does not visually reveal what she is thinking about. Although there are moments of collaboration where symbolic references are made in the visual text, in the latter, for example, the bars of the gate, the objects of her contemplation are not revealed in detail to viewers. Okay, so that's the sort of end of my first section of analysis. We'll see how much ground I can cover in the next 10 minutes or so. Hopefully then, up until this point, this initial section of analysis has demonstrated how the verbal and visual text choices work together to represent June's character as someone who is divided and introspective, exploring the representation of how she channels her thoughts and agency inwards rather than outwards. In addition, June Offred is represented as a character whom audiences are invited to contemplate as the object of attention, even while she dwells on other topics. So we can't really escape thinking about her and her point of view. So the next 2 parts of the analysis then, in my paper, in the kind of fuller paper, examines how you address work in the series and also how container metaphors operate. So I'll see how much of this I can cover in the remaining time. So given that The Handmaid's Tale in the book is a recording of June's story, as I mentioned earlier on, viewers might be expecting an intended recipient for her narrative to be revealed. We might think, okay, she is the teller of the tale, but who is the addressee? Who is she talking to? However, June's isolation is further emphasised through the absence of a clear addressee, because they remain ambiguous at both the verbal and the visual level. So across the series as a whole, June's gaze is rarely directed to the audience explicitly, so I don't think we can just say that you means the audience here. So this differs, for example, from other cinematic examples like Francis Underwood in the House of Cards series, who does directly engage the viewer with second person address and whose monologue is delivered on the same diegetic plane as the scene. And researcher Sandrine Solon has looked at this in detail recently. Despite June's central positioning and the direct close-ups of her face, her gaze during voiceovers is often actually just off-center. So it's kind of looking towards us, but not quite. It's almost like it's kind of looking over your shoulder, looking at an unknown point out of sight and not directly at the audience. So similarly, the verbal text represents an ambiguous addressee in that the you reference, it changes across the series. We have lots of different yous, and it can vary across sentences, across clauses, across voiceovers as well. So we do see lots of, for example, generalized yous. So they're talking about people generally. So you can wet the rim of a glass and run your finger around the rim and it will make a sound, as she says in episode 4 there. She also has lots of examples of horizontal address, where she addresses or talks to a character who is within the story world. So in this example here, again from episode 4, where she says, "You had to be brave to do this," she is talking to the previous handmaid in the household that she inhabits currently. What we do have fairly frequently, though, is the use of what Gibbons and Whiteley have called telecinematic self-referential address. So this is where she's kind of referring to herself via interior monologue, and she's sort of setting up a dialogue between different versions of herself. So this dialogue between versions themselves can also be seen at other points in the series, where she more performatively assumes the role of different enactors. So, for example, at the end of episode 3, in reference to not being pregnant despite the hopes of the household, she tells herself off and says, "No ice cream for you this month, young lady." And at other points, she enacts other characters as well. So this kind of performative role kind of goes a bit further. So at the end of voiceover 1.13, for example, she says, echoing her friend Moira's words from an earlier flashback, "Keep your fucking shit together." So she's kind of mirroring her friend Moira, but kind of talking to herself. However categorized, we could say that the you invites viewers to consider the addressee of June Offred's tale, and therefore further evokes a transcription template that I mentioned in the epilogue of the novel. The performative aspect of the voiceover and the you address are reminders that this is a tale about her life, which might be oriented towards a particular personal audience. In addition, the number of characters directly addressed, so Moira, her friend, Luke, her husband, past and future Offreds, function as signposts of her multiple social roles that she holds here, such as a wife, a mother, a friend, a handmaid. At the same time, the use of self-referential address is a clear indication of her split selves. She has no one to talk to within the confines of Gilead, and therefore can actually only really speak to herself here. So finally then, and I've got a few minutes before I kind of round things up, I'd just like to talk about the use of container metaphors across the series, which again is another kind of prominent FCD choice, but also appears in the visual text. So key metaphors which run throughout the Handmaid's Tale book and series relate to both to body parts and their metonymic relationships to the wider world. So an eye, for example, is the term for someone who spies for the Gilead authorities, and eyes are foregrounded in the visual text frequently, as you can see in these screenshots here. Similarly, hands are also referenced across both visual and verbal texts. Of course, they form part of the term handmaid itself, and the various refrains to each other in greeting also echo both of these choices. So the handmaids greet each other by saying, "by his hand, under his eye." So while in Gilead, hands and feet are pronounced non-essential tools, the concepts of hands as representing agency is nevertheless acknowledged, and is so poignantly in the line from the final voiceover of the series. So she says, "I've given myself over into the hands of strangers." These metaphors draw on culturally entrenched ideas of both agency and surveillance, and the isolation of particular body parts is also emblematic of the wider objectification of handmaids in Gilead more generally, and that's something you can trace through with other metaphor choices in the series, which I won't have time to talk about today. The most prominent metaphor, though, relates specifically to a kind of container metaphor. So we can see that in this voiceover from the 4th episode of the series, which is called don't let the bastards grind you down, which I feel like is always a helpful mantra to bear in mind. So this voiceover appears here then, and it can, after June experiences a flashback to a time pre-Gilead where she was with Luke, her husband, and her daughter at a fair. The present tense, "I can't do this," marks a shift from the previous voiceover, which is narrated in the past tense, and therefore shows actually a kind of spatio-temporal lag here. So June Offred is aware that she should not dwell on memories for the sake of her mental health, as signposted here, but she is reluctant to return to the present, and that's indicated by the delay in the visual text. So there's a kind of a disjunction between the progression of the visual and the verbal streams. So here there's just discordance between the two, so it suggests her reluctance, but also her disorientation in this episode. So despite her self-instruction, she is actually becoming lost in her memories. So the first metaphor we can see here is a memory is a container, which is signposted through both June Offred's mention of memories as being something you can fall into, and then later as something that you can get or become lost in. So Charteris Black, who is a metaphor researcher, argues that the existence of a clearly defined container also implies a conscious controlling entity that fills or empties that container. This is something which comes across through these metaphor constructions. So like with some of the examples of self-referential you address mentioned in the previous slides, in this latter example, June Offred established herself in two roles. She is both the conscious controlling entity who populates the memory, but she's also in control of her movement within the container. And that's summarized in that quotation: "If I let myself fall in too far, I won't ever get out." Similarly, June draws on an elaboration of this first metaphor in her description of "the room is a country," which is the next metaphor. In this manifestation, there is a switch from her mental state to her physical reality. She draws on different source domains, moving from describing her memories to describing her surroundings. She narrates how there are things in this room to discover, and casts herself as being like an explorer, a traveller to undiscovered countries. This metaphor works here by shrinking June's worlds. It adjusts the scope of her current situation of imprisonment by expanding the confinement of her room and the house to the scale of undiscovered countries, and also by conferring the specific roles of an explorer, a traveller on herself. There is also a lack of specificity with the description. She talks about how there are things to discover, but though the things is schematic, at this point in the visual text, the cupboard door is foregrounded and arguably then specified in the visual text. So the verbal text here belies the fact that she already knows all parts of the room really, really, really well, because she's been there and imprisoned there for so long, and enables her to maintain the performance of herself as an explorer rather than a prisoner in this scenario. So container metaphors then can be seen elsewhere in the series, and the more superordinate metaphor, the self is a container, is also evoked. So when June Offred portrays Moira, for example, she describes how the self can be both a container, or rather it can be a container that provides protection. So she says they didn't get everything, there was something inside her that they couldn't take away. She looked invincible. Equally, the idea that invasion into this container is a type of assault is suggested in June's reference to an Atwood poem, which she quotes in the 5th episode of the series. So she quotes, "You fit into me like a hook into an eye, a fish hook, an open eye." In a world that stripped women of the physical right to their own bodies, the variations of container metaphors manifested in the series, and the idea that the mental sense of self is something that can be autonomously separated and contained, therefore seem particularly appropriate and salient at this point in the narrative. Okay, so just to draw things together then, I think, yeah, I'm doing all right for time, so that's very good. So I would argue then that one of the kind of stylistic effects that's generated by the way that split selves are set up here is that this presentation of June Offred's character heightens the defamiliarization that we experience in the story world. It kind of contributes to that sort of sense of claustrophobia that we experience when we watch this series, or the kind of unsettling kind of horror-like aspect that we get. So throughout the series and throughout watching it, the viewer isn't allowed to be an impartial observer. We're in June's head throughout, and as Chandler says here, each episode resonates as we watch in fear of what might unfold next. That said, though, whilst we are in our head, the stylized choices of the FCD, the production choices, mean that the narrator mediation role is never fully backgrounded, even when other linguistic elements in a scene strongly subjectify the account being offered. And this contributes to that overarching and overwhelming sense or kind of theme of surveillance and kind of filtered narrative that we get in this series. In other words, and as in the book, in Gilead, your account is always one which is mediated and one which is never entirely your own. And I think I'll leave it there for the paper, and I'll open up the floor to questions.
Thank you so much, Chloe, for an outstanding paper. That really was thoroughly enjoyable and really interesting discussion there. So we've got just over 10 minutes, between 10 and 15 minutes for any comments or questions. Lots of positive feedback in the room. Kathy, got your hand up. Did you want to come onto the mic?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know if you can see me as well. I don't know how this platform works, but anyway, yeah, thanks very much for the talk. I really enjoyed it, and I also read the paper in language and literature, and it's prompted me to watch the series. I'm only about halfway through series one at the moment. Yeah, I know. It's going slowly at the moment.
Yeah.
So yeah, I had a couple of questions. One is that when I looked at the written narratives myself, in what's written illness narratives, I was very struck there by quite explicit mentions of people being split in two. I mean, they actually say this, I'm split in two. And I'm not sure from what I've seen so far whether that actually happens, in this series, or whether it's all sort of mediated through, the visual disjunction and the voiceovers and all that sort of stuff. So maybe it's not necessary. Shall I go on to my next one, or do you want to answer that one first?
Yeah, do you want to go to the next one, Kathy?
I'll go to my next one. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
So yeah, so I was just sort of interested in whether, because like in illness narratives, you hear like cancer narratives, and they're always talking about being split in two, and it's very sort of traumatic. But as I say, I'm not sure whether it's said explicitly in this sort of way, or whether it just comes through the production. The second thing was, I thought the explorer metaphor was very interesting, and I can't remember if it's in the paper that you cite, but in one of the illness narratives I've looked at, you have a person who's had a stroke, who's crawling across the floor trying to get to the telephone, and he describes himself as being like a pioneer crossing the Rocky Mountains, and it sort of like really struck me when I was watching that episode where she's in the room, and it's that whole, you mentioned the sense of scale and everything, and how that works, and the whole sort of magnitude, like for a person with a stroke, it's a massive thing to get across the living room. But in your case, I was really quite shocked when I was watching that episode that it was like, well, where's she going to go? Because I didn't know what was going to happen. But then she crawls into the cupboard, and then she finds something actually that doesn't at the time perhaps seem that significant, because I've read the book, and I knew that anything in writing was really significant. So I'm not sure they're just, exploring, it's not just, I think, containers, it's also this, what are you going to find gearing you up for it? It's not really a question, but I thought maybe you want to just comment on that bit.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that, Kathy. Yeah, both really kind of interesting things to kind of flag up, actually. So let's start with the kind of first thing you raised then. So yeah, I would agree that it's not something that kind of, she doesn't, in this series, she doesn't explicitly talk about herself as being split, that kind of division, and the kind of fact that we have the different iterations of roles, I think, well, I would argue, is kind of manifested elsewhere through the visual and the kind of the verbal text, so it's kind of more implied. That said, the kind of idea for this paper came to me as I was watching the second series sort of afterwards, and I kind of went back to this first one thinking that it would be a good place to start, and then I kind of noticed the things that I've talked about today. So actually, I know that Erica just mentioned in the chat that she's rewatching the series as well. I think I need to go back to series 2 to see whether that's something that does become more explicit in the series. I mean, obviously with this analysis, I've focused on the first series alone, but I wonder, and yeah, I think possibly it becomes something that kind of gets addressed a bit more explicitly as it goes on. So I need to revisit that. Yeah, the second point about the explorer metaphor. No, I completely agree. And again, I mean, I picked out that example because I think that is a kind of, there's a lot going on in that particular voiceover and that particular episode. That said, I don't think she doesn't make references to explorers in any other kind of voiceover in this series. So that is a kind of a particular, I guess it's not really a container metaphor specifically, is it? But I guess you could say it's a kind of an extension of it maybe in some ways. But I agree that it's used in a very interesting way in that episode, and that episode is because she's locked in her room throughout the entire episode. It is really claustrophobic, isn't it? You don't, as you say, you don't know if she's going to be let out. Yeah, the kind of her world shrinks to just this room and just the cupboard that she kind of hides in, I guess. But yeah, that's something to think about. But yeah, thank you for that, Kathy.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got any questions or comments? Just trying to see what's in the chat. Lots of positive things being said, but any more questions? Chloe, I've got one while people are thinking, and this I haven't seen any of the TV series. I know the novel and the sequel very well, so I suppose this might be quite an obvious question to you, but how much of the relationship you were talking about between the voiceover and the visual is sort of idiosyncratic, or is this a sort of conventional thing across other TV shows that do this? I.e., how original is The Handmaid's Tale in this?
I think that's a really good question, and something to examine in a bit more detail, I think. So I guess some of those things I mentioned with the kind of shallow focus plus symmetrical composition plus kind of sustained focus on her face during the voiceover, that does seem to be unusual, in that, because as I said earlier on, you are primed for a point of view shot normally where you see a character looking at something and talking about something that's kind of just off stage. So the fact it doesn't reveal it seems to be, I don't know if it's necessarily kind of a unique choice, but certainly in relation to how it's used here, it's used in a unique way. And again, I guess there are other examples, like I talked about Sandrine Solon's analysis of Francis Underwood in House of Cards. He does address the audience specifically, but that is quite different, because it's the readers there are actually kind of directly, or the reviewers rather, are directly addressed in that context. The short answer is I don't really know, and I think it would probably warrant a bigger study and lots more TV watching, I think.
Yeah. Good reason to do that, and I suppose it depends on the director as well. I mean, you spoke of Kubrick, for example, so highly stylized, for example, impose ways of seeing the world.
Yeah, definitely the director and also the genre, I guess, as well. I think they're kind of focusing on the face and looking at the kind of reaction is definitely kind of hallmark of horror specifically as well. So yeah, director and genre.
Yeah, thank you. Helen's got a question. Over to Helen.
Hi, Marcello, Chloe, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, I was just thinking, Daniel has stolen my question, but that's okay, Daniel. That is exactly what I was going to ask you, was about you, because I think you have seen it, Chloe. That's okay, Daniel. I think possibly you've seen it, Chloe. I'm not sure, but there are some, Netflix drama, kind of similar, I mean, not similar themes possibly in terms of maybe some psychological suspense aspects, but there's some really fascinating stuff in terms of, I was just thinking about the audience is looking at the main character, the main female character, but we're hearing Joe's kind of narrative towards her, which is creating all kinds of a very weird, disjointed kind of feeling. And I was just thinking some of these, this relates to what Marcello said too. I mean, it is creating that horror sense of horror, even if it's not a conventional horror genre. And I'm wondering if this is quite a common pattern, but that's something, yeah, that I think some of these this could be applied to you, and of course used based on a novel too, although I think it has been changed quite a bit for the TV adaptation. So yeah, it's just more of a comment than a question. Sorry, I hate when people do that, and now I've done it. But yeah, it just occurred to me, Chloe. I don't know if you want to speak to that or say anything in relation to that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for mentioning, and also to Daniel for mentioning in the chat. To be honest, my PhD student Paula, who's here today, might be best placed to answer this, because I know that she's done a study of you and kind of audience kind of empathy. So maybe she can provide a fuller answer at a later stage. But I think based on I have seen the series You on Netflix, and I think from what I remember in these scenes where that kind of voiceover and the kind of, and you're right, it's also shallow focus actually, isn't it? We are kind of close to his face. Unlike with The Handmaid's Tale, though, we do actually see what he's looking at.
Yeah.
And in the context of the series, that is obviously the kind of for those who haven't seen You, it's a kind of a stalker narrative. So he's kind of following different women across the various series. So that's actually slightly different, because you're watching him watching someone else. So actually, it's the point of view kind of that kind of point of view shot expectation is actually kind of sort of fulfilled in that text, because you see what
a bit more conventional in that sense.
Yeah, in that sense, but you are again closely aligned or looking at his face, so you are watching him watching someone else. And again, as I said, with The Handmaid's Tale, that's different in that you don't really see what she's looking at or what she's kind of talking about in these kind of voiceovers. So we're kind of given her face, so that is the kind of difference there. So I guess it's still kind of feeds into that kind of surveillance aspect, doesn't it? That kind of close watching that we're doing of other people.
Yes, the surveillance narrative of watching someone watch. So it's always filtered through something else. I guess it's just how far removed is that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And
Okay,
it looks
great.
like Paula said in the chat that she's going to explore that at our Applied Stylistics Symposium. So we look forward to that, Paula. It'd be great to hear some more about that.
That sounds great, really interesting. Thanks, Chloe and Paula. Thank you.
Okay, thanks Helen for that question, stroke comment, stroke question. Are there any? We've got 1 minute left, so there's time for just any final comments to Chloe or questions. Otherwise, I think that's probably it.
I think it might be lunchtime.
Yeah, it's getting very close to 1 o'clock, isn't it? Well, thank you once again to Chloe for an absolutely brilliant paper, and thanks to everybody for coming. If you were around right at the beginning, I did say in error that this was the last talk. In fact, it's not. I must be brain dead at the end of the semester. We've got 2 further talks in this series. The first is on Wednesday, the 21st of April, when Dr. Nur Kutuglu-Hooden will be talking about discourses of online running, or discourses around an online running community, and then a further session on the 12th of May with Emmanuel Lebeur, and including, without excluding, a challenge for the French language. So I hope you'll be able to join us for one or both of those. And thanks once again for your attendance this afternoon. So thank you, and see you soon.